The gavel's sharp crack silenced the crowded auction hall. 7-year-old Emma Brownlee clutched her pink piggy bank against her chest, coins jingling faintly as she trembled. Her wide eyes, red-rimmed from crying all morning, tracked the bidding paddles rising around her like a forest of hope being cut down with each escalating number. 57,500, announced the auctioneer, his voice echoing through the suddenly stifling room. Do I hear 60? Across the room, separated by a sea of adults, Rex the German Shepherd, who had been her father's loyal partner for years, sensed her distress. The dog's ears pricked forward, dark eyes locking onto Emma's small form. With a sudden lunge that caught his handler off guard, Rex pulled against his leash, a low whine escaping his throat as he strained toward the little girl. The handler yanked him back, but not before everyone saw it, the undeniable connection between child and animal. Margaret Brownlee wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders as fresh tears spilled down Emma's cheeks. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about the only living connection to her father, the only creature who had heard her voice in 5 years. And with each bid, that connection was slipping further away, like her father had that terrible day in 2010 forever beyond her reach. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Deputy Samuel Brownlee was a fixture in Weld County, Colorado, his cruiser a familiar sight along the rural highways. For 8 years, he and his K9 partner Rex, a broad-chested German Shepherd with intelligent eyes and unwavering loyalty, had been inseparable. Their reputation was sterling: 14 drug busts, 6 missing persons found, and 3 suspects apprehended trying to flee justice. But to Samuel's wife Margaret and daughter Emma, they were simply the boys, who came home each night, boots and paws tramping through the kitchen to the smell of dinner cooking. Emma, with her father's blue eyes and quick smile, had grown up with Rex as her protector, playmate, and confidant, the dog tolerating tea parties and costume dress-up with the same stoic patience he showed on duty. The November morning in 2010 that changed everything began like any other shift. Samuel kissed Margaret goodbye at the door, tousled 3-year-old Emma's blonde curls, and whistled for Rex to follow him to the cruiser. By afternoon, a high-speed chase across county lines ended with Deputy Brownlee's vehicle forced off the road. Rex, secured in the back compartment, survived with minor injuries, but Samuel Brownlee died at the scene, his body shielding a young deputy from gunfire. The trauma embedded itself deeply in both the dog and the child, Rex falling into a kennel depression that concerned the K9 handlers, and Emma retreating into a world of silence. The selective mutism developed gradually. First she spoke only to her mother, then only in whispers, until finally Dr. Patricia Winters confirmed what Margaret already suspected. Emma now spoke only to Rex during their supervised visits, when no one else could hear. The cast surrounding their story grew over the 5 years since Samuel's death. Chief Michael Dawson, a by-the-book administrator who insisted department policy required all retiring K9s be auctioned rather than adopted. Richard Cooper, who married Margaret 2 years after Samuel's death and viewed his stepdaughter's attachment to Rex as unhealthy, dwelling in the past. Then there were the newcomers to their drama: Steve Wells, a wealthy farmer whose interest in the auction remained a mystery, and James Blackwell, owner of Elite Security Services, but who made no secret of wanting Rex for his premium bloodline and extensive training record. Against these powerful interests stood a silent child with a piggy bank and a broken heart. The memorandum arrived on a Tuesday morning, a seemingly innocuous department-wide email that would shatter the fragile peace Margaret had carefully constructed for her daughter. Pursuant to Weld County Sheriff's Department Policy 5.14.3, K9 Unit Rex IDBUC K9U0472, and will be retired from active service effective February 28, 2015, due to age and departmental restructuring. In accordance with established protocol, retired K9 assets will be auctioned at the annual Fallen Officers Benefit Fund event on March 15, 2015. Proceeds will support families of officers lost in the line of duty. Chief Michael Dawson had highlighted the policy section in his email, a preemptive defense against the questions he anticipated. 5 years earlier, a retiring handler had taken his K9 partner home, only to have the improperly supervised dog bite a neighborhood child. The resulting lawsuit had cost the department hundreds of thousands of dollars and prompted the creation of the auction policy, a clean break that transferred liability and generated funds for good causes. To Dawson, the policy represented sound fiscal management and risk mitigation. To Margaret Brownlee, reading the email forwarded by a sympathetic dispatcher, it was a declaration of war. "They can't do this," she whispered, hands shaking as she set down her phone. Across the kitchen, Richard Cooper looked up from his newspaper with a carefully neutral expression. "The department owns the dog, Maggie." "They always have," he said, his tone reasonable in a way that had begun to grate on her nerves. "Besides, Emma needs to move forward. It's been 5 years." Margaret said nothing, watching through the window as Emma sat on the porch swing, a picture book open on her lap that she hadn't turned a page of in 30 minutes. The weekly visits to see Rex at the K-9 training facility had become the anchoring points of her daughter's existence. Every Wednesday afternoon, Emma would clutch her father's old badge, now hanging from a chain around her neck, while they drove to the facility. The transformation once she was with Rex was remarkable. Her rigid posture would soften, her perpetual frown would ease, and though Margaret couldn't hear the words, she would see her daughter's lips moving as she whispered secrets into the shepherd's attentive ear. Last Christmas, the K-9 handler had shared security footage that brought Margaret to tears. Emma reading aloud from the night before Christmas to Rex, her voice inaudible on the silent video, but clearly animated as the dog rested his head in her lap. It was the only confirmation that her daughter still possessed the ability to speak at all. These thoughts raced through Margaret's mind as she drove to tell Emma about the auction. The memory of Samuel teaching their daughter how to approach Rex safely surfaced unbidden. "Always let him see you coming, Emmy Bear. No surprises for a working dog. Slow and steady, palm out, just like we practiced." Samuel's patience as tiny Emma solemnly followed instructions, Rex sitting at perfect attention despite the toddler's wobbly approach. Later, as Emma grew older, Samuel showing her how to fill Rex's water bowl, measure his food, brush his coat, small responsibilities that made her beam with pride. Emma's reaction to the news exceeded Margaret's worst fears. No tantrum, no tears, just a retreat so complete that Dr. Winters made an emergency house call that evening. "This is a significant setback," the therapist explained after attempting to engage Emma, who sat motionless on her bed, eyes fixed on a photograph of her father and Rex in their department portrait. "The selective mutism has been resistant to traditional therapy, but her connection with Rex represents our best avenue for eventual recovery." Severing that connection now, Dr. Winters trailed off, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine concern. The trauma of losing her father became manageable for Emma only through her relationship with Rex. "He's not just a dog to her, he's continuity, safety, and the last tangible connection to Samuel." As Dr. Winters gathered her notes to leave, she placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "If there's any way to keep Rex in Emma's life, I would pursue it with every resource available to you. From a clinical perspective, I believe their separation would significantly impede her recovery trajectory." That night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep clutching her father's old uniform shirt, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with determination hardening her resolve. Richard's suggestion that they just get her another dog had been met with icy silence. She opened her laptop and created a GoFundMe page titled "Help Emma Keep Her Father's Legacy." With shaking fingers, she uploaded a photo of Emma with Rex from their last visit, the only recent picture where her daughter's face showed something close to peace. "I don't care what it takes," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "That dog is coming home where he belongs." The GoFundMe campaign launched at midnight, Margaret's fingers trembling as she pressed publish. By dawn, the Weld County community had already contributed $487, a promising start, but nowhere near the estimated $12,500 value of a trained police K-9. She shared the link to her social media accounts and sent it to friends from church, former colleagues of Samuel's, and parents from Emma's school. Within 48 hours, the campaign had been shared over 300 times and raised just over $1,200. Margaret allowed herself a flicker of hope. On the third day, the Weld County Tribune picked up the story. Child of fallen hero seeks to reunite with father's canine partner ran above the fold, featuring a photograph of Emma from happier days, sitting beside her father and Rex on the front porch of their home. Reporter Jason Mills had interviewed Margaret extensively, capturing the heartbreak of Emma's condition and the therapeutic value of her bond with Rex. The article also included statements from Dr. Winters regarding the potential psychological impact of separating Emma from the dog, carefully worded to maintain patient confidentiality while emphasizing the clinical importance of maintaining this connection. What Margaret hadn't anticipated was the controversy the article would ignite. By the following morning, the Tribune's online version had accumulated over 200 comments, sharply divided in opinion. "That poor child deserves to have her father's dog," wrote one commenter, while another argued police canines are working animals, not pets. "They require specialized handling. This is irresponsible." Local television stations picked up the story, and a segment on Denver's Channel 9 News featured opinions from canine trainers, child psychologists, and law enforcement officials, all weighing in on whether a traumatized child should become the new handler for a retired police dog. "These animals are trained to attack on command," stated retired canine trainer Martin Reeves on the evening broadcast. "Without proper ongoing handling, they can present a serious risk, especially around children." This was immediately countered by Dr. Elizabeth Norton, a child trauma specialist. "The stability of maintaining emotional connections is paramount for children who've experienced profound loss. The potential benefits may outweigh the risks if proper support systems are in place." As public debate intensified, the GoFundMe total climbed to $3,465, still far short of what would likely be needed at auction, where trained police dogs often commanded premium prices. Margaret noticed with growing unease that her husband Richard seemed increasingly frustrated by the campaign's prominence. Publicly, he maintained supportive appearances, even posing for a newspaper photograph with his arm around Emma's shoulders. But privately, his comments revealed a different sentiment. "This has gone far enough, Maggie," he said one evening after Emma had gone to bed. "You've got half the county talking about Samuel again, like the last 5 years never happened. What about our family? What about moving forward?" His voice had an edge that made Margaret pause as she folded laundry at the kitchen table. "Emma is our family," she replied carefully. "And this is about her healing, not about Samuel." Richard's laugh held no humor. "Everything in this house is about Samuel. His photographs everywhere, his badge that she wears, his uniform still hanging in the closet. Now you want his dog too. When does Richard Cooper's family begin?" The argument ended in strained silence, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted. 2 days later, she noticed Richard taking a business call in the garage, unusual for him, as he typically used his home office. Through the window, she observed his animated gestures, his expression intense in a way that sparked concern. When he ended the call and saw her watching, his smile seemed forced. "Just work," he said casually, but avoided meeting her eyes. It was Emma's teacher, Mrs. Bennett, who inadvertently provided the first concrete evidence of Richard's subterfuge. "Your husband mentioned you might be reconsidering the dog adoption," she said during their parent-teacher conference. He explained that Emma's therapist was suggesting a fresh start might be healthier, perhaps a new puppy instead. Margaret maintained her composure until the meeting ended, then sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel as anger coursed through her. Richard had never spoken to Dr. Winters. The fresh start theory directly contradicted the therapist's explicit recommendations. He was actively undermining their efforts, spreading misinformation through their community networks. That evening, while searching for stamps in Richard's desk drawer, she found a business card for James Blackwell of Elite Security Services, the same Blackwell who had been quoted in the Tribune expressing interest in acquiring retired police dogs for his private security firm. The card had Richard's handwriting on the back, "Thursday, 2 p.m., Westridge Coffee." Margaret's suspicions crystallized 2 days later when she deliberately arrived early to pick Emma up from school, driving past Westridge Coffee on her route. Through the plate glass window, she clearly saw Richard seated across from a man whose photograph had appeared in the newspaper article. James Blackwell himself, known for his interest in acquiring wrecks for his commercial security operations. The conversation appeared animated, with Richard nodding emphatically as Blackwell slid what looked like documents across the table. Meanwhile, as the auction date approached, a new bidder emerged who captured community attention. Steve Wells, a wealthy farmer whose sprawling property lay at the county's northern edge, had begun asking questions about the auction process. Wells was something of a local mystery, a man who had inherited his father's agricultural empire but rarely participated in community events. His sudden interest in a retiring police dog sparked speculation, especially when he toured the K9 facility and spent considerable time observing Rex. The handler reported that Wells had asked detailed questions about Rex's training, health history, and temperament around children. Most curious was his request to know which days Emma visited, though he never explained his interest. When Margaret learned of Wells' inquiries, she felt a confusing mixture of threat and curiosity. Another wealthy bidder would make their uphill battle even steeper, yet something about the timing and nature of his question suggested motivations beyond the obvious. With just 10 days remaining before the auction, the GoFundMe had plateaued at just under $3,500. Margaret began selling personal items, jewelry, electronics, even considering a second mortgage, while community debate intensified and Richard's deception continued in the shadows. Emma, oblivious to the adult machinations surrounding her future with Rex, simply marked off each day on her calendar until her next visit with the dog who carried her secrets, her voice, and her last connection to her father. As news of the upcoming auction spread throughout Weld County, the community polarized into increasingly entrenched camps. The local diner became an unofficial debate hall where morning coffee conversations inevitably turned to the Brownlee girl and that police dog. The Weld County Tribune devoted an entire Sunday edition to exploring the controversy, interviewing experts from various fields to examine the situation from multiple angles. The front page headline read, "More Than a Dog, Community Divided Over Retired K9's Future." What precedent would we set by making an exception to department policy? Asked retired Judge Harold Finch in the article. While the emotional appeal is undeniable, law enforcement protocols exist for public safety reasons. These aren't arbitrary rules to be discarded when they become inconvenient. The judge's perspective was echoed by several police administrators from neighboring counties, all emphasizing the liability concerns surrounding the placement of trained police dogs in civilian homes. In stark contrast, the human interest section featured an interview with Sergeant Maria Vasquez, who had worked alongside Samuel Brownlee for 6 years. Rex isn't just department property, she argued. He's a living connection to an officer who gave his life in service. We talk about supporting fallen officers' families. This is exactly what that should look like. Her sentiment was shared by dozens of current and retired officers who had begun wearing small blue ribbons on their uniforms to signify their support for Emma's cause. The medical community entered the debate when the regional chapter of the American Psychological Association issued a statement addressing the therapeutic value of animal connections for children experiencing trauma. While carefully avoiding specific mention of Emma's case, the timing left little doubt about its relevance. Consistent emotional support systems, including bonded animals, can provide crucial stability during childhood trauma recovery. Disruption of such bonds should be approached with extreme caution and professional clinical assessment. Chief Dawson found himself increasingly on the defensive as community pressure mounted. At a county commissioners' meeting, he stood firm amid pointed questions. The department policy was implemented after thorough review and legal consultation. While we sympathize with the Brownlee family's attachment to K9 Rex, the precedent of allowing emotional appeals to override established protocol puts the department at risk. The auction proceeds will benefit many families of fallen officers, not just one. This pragmatic stance seemed cold to many, particularly when contrasted with footage of Emma's weekly visits with Rex, captured respectfully from a distance by news cameras. The silent child walking beside her mother, small fingers clutching her father's badge, but her entire demeanor transforming upon seeing the German Shepherd. These images spoke louder than policy documents or liability concerns. Local businesses began posting flyers supporting the GoFundMe, and Weld County Elementary School held a penny drive that raised nearly $300 from children emptying their piggy banks for their classmate. Behind the scenes, Richard Cooper's campaign of sabotage grew more sophisticated. Margaret discovered that several large potential donors had mysteriously withdrawn their support after conversations clarifying the situation. When she confronted Richard in their bedroom one evening, his facade finally cracked. "You're living in a shrine to your dead husband," he said, voice tight with suppressed anger. "Every day I walk into a house where another man's presence overshadows everything. His photographs watching me from every wall. His daughter, yes, his, because she's made it clear I'll never be her father, wearing his badge like a talisman. Now you want to bring home his dog. When does this end?" "Margaret? Margaret?" Margaret stood very still, absorbing the bitterness she'd suspected but never heard so plainly expressed. "This isn't about Samuel, it's about Emma." "It's always about one of them, never about us," Richard countered. "I've built my life around you both for 3 years, but there's no room for me in this family. That dog represents everything keeping us from moving forward." "Moving forward doesn't mean erasing the past," Margaret replied quietly. "Emma needs connection to heal, not forced forgetting." The argument escalated until Richard finally admitted his meetings with Blackwell. "He'll ensure the dog goes to a professional environment where it belongs. His company has offered me a consulting position contingent on helping secure Rex for their program. It's a good opportunity, Margaret, for all of us." "You're undermining your stepdaughter's chance to heal for a job offer?" Margaret's voice held more sadness than anger. "I'm trying to build a future for this family that isn't perpetually mourning," Richard shouted, then immediately lowered his voice, glancing toward Emma's bedroom. "Blackwell's company needs Rex's bloodline and training background. They'll pay well above market value money we could use for specialized therapy for Emma, maybe at that residential program in Denver we couldn't afford." "You want to send her away?" It wasn't a question. "I want her to get professional help. I want our marriage to have a chance. Is that so wrong?" The revelation of Richard's alliance with Blackwell created a deepening rift in the household. He slept in the guest room, and conversations became limited to necessary logistics about Emma's care. Margaret considered asking him to leave entirely, but worried about further destabilizing Emma's environment before the auction. Instead, she doubled down on fundraising efforts, selling her wedding rings from her marriage to Samuel, a decision that brought both pain and a sense of closure as she let go of one tangible connection to preserve another. While the adults in her life maneuvered around her, Emma's world remained narrowly focused on her weekly visits with Rex. The K9 facility had begun allowing her slightly longer sessions, impressed by the positive response Rex showed to her presence. The normally stoic working dog, who had grown somewhat withdrawn after Samuel's death, displayed remarkable attentiveness around Emma. Handler Officer Brian Murphy noted that Rex's demeanor improved significantly on days when Emma visited, his training responses sharper and more focused. During one such visit, while Officer Murphy stepped away briefly to answer a call, security cameras captured a moment that would later become crucial. Emma removed her father's badge from around her neck, the small piece of metal catching the light as she held it toward Rex. The shepherd's recognition was immediate and unmistakable, ears forward, posture alert, eyes fixed on the badge with the same intensity he once showed responding to Samuel's commands. Emma's lips moved, her words inaudible to the recording but clearly meaningful to Rex, who placed a paw gently on her knee in a gesture unnervingly similar to how he had once responded to her father's hand signals. The footage, when Murphy reviewed it later, left such an impression that he saved a copy before submitting his standard visitation report. The connection between subject minor and K9 Rex continues to demonstrate unusual depth. He wrote clinically, though his personal notes were more direct, "This isn't just familiarity. This is a working bond." As auction day approached, just 1 week away, Margaret received an unexpected call from Steve Wells' assistant requesting a meeting. Cautious but curious, she agreed to meet the wealthy farmer at a neutral location, the county library, where they could speak privately in a reserved conference room. Wells arrived precisely on time, but an imposing figure in his 60s with weathered features and the calloused hands of someone who still worked his land despite his considerable wealth. He declined refreshments and came directly to the point. "Mrs. Cooper, I understand you're trying to purchase your late husband's canine partner for your daughter," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "I'd like to know why this matters so much to you both." Margaret had prepared arguments about therapeutic value and emotional connections, but something in Wells' direct approach prompted raw honesty instead. "Rex is the only living being who was with my husband when he died, and he's the only one my daughter will speak to now. I've tried everything to help her: therapy, medication, support groups. Nothing has worked except those visits with Rex." Wells nodded, his expression unreadable. "My sources tell me Blackwell is prepared to bid up to $50,000 for the dog. He wants the bloodline for his breeding program." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. Their GoFundMe had barely reached $4,000. Even with her sold jewelry and potential loans, they couldn't approach that figure. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, suddenly suspicious. "Are you working with Blackwell too?" "No, ma am," Wells replied, something flashing across his features that resembled pain. "I have my own reasons for attending that auction. I just wanted to understand what I'm involving myself in." He stood to leave but paused at the door. "Your daughter, she shares a birthday with her father, correct? March 10th? Margaret nodded, confused by the question. "My Sarah would have been 35 this year," Wells said, so quietly she almost missed it. Before she could ask who Sarah was, he was gone, leaving Margaret with more questions than answers. The day before the auction, Emma's 7th birthday dawned cold and clear. Margaret had planned a small celebration, though Emma showed little interest in the decorated cupcakes or wrapped presents. She sat at the kitchen table, methodically working on drawing a portrait of Rex rendered with surprising skill for a child her age. When Richard entered the kitchen, Emma immediately covered her artwork with her arm, a small but telling gesture that broke Margaret's heart. "I need to speak with you," Richard said to Margaret, gesturing toward the living room. His expression was uncharacteristically somber. Once they were alone, he handed her an envelope. "I've withdrawn my consultation application with Blackwell," he said, "and I've added what I can to your fund for tomorrow. It's not much, but—" Margaret opened the envelope to find $1,200 in cash. She looked up at him, confused by this sudden reversal. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I saw Dr. Winters yesterday. I told her I was worried about enabling Emma's attachment to the past. She helped me understand something important." He paused, clearly struggling. "She said Emma doesn't speak to Rex because he represents Samuel. She speaks to Rex because he's the only one who doesn't expect her to be fixed or different or over it by now. He just accepts her silence and her grief without trying to change her." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "I realized I've been doing exactly what Rex doesn't, expecting her to move on from a loss I've never fully acknowledged myself." Margaret felt tears threatening but held them back. "It may not be enough," she said, looking at the money. "Blackwell has corporate backing." "I know," Richard acknowledged, "but at least now we're on the same side." That evening, after Richard had gone to bed, Margaret sat with Emma on the porch swing, gently rocking in the cool spring air. Emma held her father's badge, thumb tracing its contours in a familiar, soothing pattern. "Tomorrow's a big day," Margaret said softly, not expecting a response. "We're going to try our very best to bring Rex home with us. I can't promise we'll win, Emmy Bear, but I promise we're going to try with everything we have." Emma continued staring at the badge, but her free hand found Margaret's and squeezed a small gesture that spoke volumes. As they sat together under the stars, Margaret allowed herself to hope, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Their total funds now stood at $5,665, a substantial amount for a family of modest means, but nowhere near what Blackwell could command. What Margaret didn't know as she finally tucked Emma into bed that night was that Steve Wells was sitting in his study 20 miles away, looking at an old photograph of a smiling teenage girl with a German Shepherd puppy in her arms. Sarah Wells had died in the same month as Samuel Brownlee, though in very different circumstances, a car accident on an icy road that no one could have prevented. The puppy in the photograph, a gift for her 16th birthday, had been waiting at home, never to meet its intended owner. Wells placed the photograph back on his desk and opened his checkbook, methodically writing out a figure that would ensure victory at tomorrow's auction, regardless of Blackwell's resources. His motivations remained his own, a private calculus of loss and possibility that he shared with no one. As he sealed the check in an envelope, he glanced again at his daughter's photograph and nodded once, decision made. Across town, in the K-9 facility, Officer Murphy made his final rounds. Pausing at Rex's kennel, he noticed the dog was awake, sitting at alert as if waiting for a command. "Big day tomorrow, boy," Murphy said conversationally. "Lots of people want you." Rex's ears twitched at his voice, but the shepherd's attention seemed elsewhere, focused on something beyond the kennel walls, as if listening for a voice only he could hear. The morning of March 15th dawned with a crystalline blue sky that belied the emotional storm brewing inside the Weld County Community Center. The annual Fallen Officers Benefit Fund auction typically drew modest attendance, mostly department personnel, local businesses making charitable contributions, and a few interested citizens. Today, however, the parking lot overflowed with news vans from Denver stations positioned strategically near the entrance. Margaret spent extra time helping Emma prepare, braiding her blonde hair with trembling fingers while explaining again how the auction would work. "There will be lots of people and noise, sweetheart. If it gets too much, squeeze my hand, and we'll step outside for a break." Emma nodded solemnly, her focus entirely on the treasured possession she'd insisted on bringing, her pink ceramic piggy bank, but now containing every penny she'd saved over the past 5 years. The weight of coins and small bills within represented birthday money, tooth fairy visits, and allowance carefully preserved. In Emma's mind, it represented her contribution to bringing Rex home. Richard waited for them in the kitchen, his demeanor subdued but supportive. The fragile truce between him and Margaret held as they drove to the community center, Emma clutching her piggy bank in the back seat. They arrived to find a crowd already gathering in the auditorium, where folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a small stage. At the front, a table displayed photographs of fallen officers alongside information about the charity. To the side stood a podium where the auctioneer would conduct proceedings. Chief Dawson intercepted them at the entrance, his official demeanor softened slightly by the occasion. "Mrs. Cooper, I want you to know that regardless of today's outcome, the department recognizes your daughter's connection to K-9 Rex. We've arranged for continued visitation rights if—" He glanced at Emma, modifying his phrasing if circumstances require it. Margaret nodded tightly. "Thank you, Chief. But we're here to bring Rex home." Inside, they found seats near the front, saved by Sergeant Vasquez and several other officers who had worked with Samuel. Most wore the blue ribbons that had become symbols of support for Emma's cause. Across the aisle, James Blackwell sat with 2 associates, their tailored suits and confident postures contrasting sharply with the casual attire of most attendees. Blackwell nodded cordially toward Margaret, his expression revealing nothing of his intentions. Steve Wells arrived minutes before the auction began, taking a seat at the back of the room. Few recognized the reclusive farmer, though his entrance drew some attention simply because he was one of the last to arrive. He acknowledged no one, his weathered face impassive as he studied the printed auction program. Officer Murphy appeared at the side entrance, leading Rex on a leash. The German Shepherd moved with the disciplined grace of his training, though those familiar with K-9 behavior noted his alertness, ears forward as if searching the crowd. When Rex spotted Emma, a visible change came over him, a subtle shift in posture that any handler would recognize as focused interest. Emma's grip on her mother's hand tightened, her eyes never leaving the dog. The auction began with standard items, gift baskets from local businesses, sports memorabilia, vacation packages donated by regional resorts. Margaret barely registered these preliminaries, her attention divided between Emma's rigid posture beside her and the steadily approaching moment when Rex would take center stage. Finally, the auctioneer announced, "Next item, ladies and gentlemen, is the retirement placement of K9 Rex, a 7-year-old German Shepherd with distinguished service to the Weld County Sheriff's Department. Rex has received specialized training valued at approximately $12,500, including narcotics detection, suspect apprehension, and search and rescue certification. Due to departmental policy regarding K9 retirement, Rex is being offered to the highest bidder, with proceeds benefiting the Fallen Officers Fund." Officer Murphy led Rex to the stage, commanding him to sit at attention. Under the bright lights, the shepherd's coat gleamed, his alert posture demonstrating the expensive training referenced in the auctioneer's introduction. "We'll open the bidding at $2,500, the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear $2,500? Margaret raised her numbered paddle immediately. Several other paddles rose as well, including Blackwell's. The initial flurry of bidding moved swiftly. "I have $2,500, now $3,000. $3,000 from number 42. Now $3,500. Emma opened her piggy bank as the figures climbed, carefully counting out coins and small bills on her lap. The poignancy of this action, a child counting pennies while adults bid thousands, did not go unnoticed, especially when a photographer captured the moment for what would become the next day's front page image. At $5,000, most casual bidders dropped out, leaving Margaret and Blackwell in direct competition. Richard placed a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder as she raised their paddle for $5,500. Blackwell immediately countered with $7,500. "I have $7,500 from number 16. "Looking for $8,000, the auctioneer called, his practiced gaze sweeping the room. Margaret hesitated, mentally calculating. Their total funds were $5,665. They had already exceeded their limit. With visible reluctance, she shook her head. Going once at $7,500. From the back of the room, a deep voice called $10,000. Steve Wells raised his paddle, entering the bidding for the first time. A murmur rippled through the crowd as heads turned to identify the new bidder. Blackwell's expression darkened slightly, but he raised his paddle. $12,500. $15,000. Wells countered immediately. On stage, Rex had remained in perfect sit-stay position, but his attention had fixed on Emma. As the bidding escalated, a low whine escaped him, subtle enough that only Officer Murphy noticed, placing a calming hand on the dog's head. The bidding war between Wells and Blackwell accelerated with breathtaking speed. $20,000. $25,000. $30,000. At this point, the auctioneer paused, clearly taken aback by the figures being called for a retired police dog. "Ladies and gentlemen, I remind you that this is a tax-deductible donation to the Fallen Officers Fund." This announcement seemed to further energize the bidders. Blackwell's associate leaned in, whispering urgently, but Blackwell waved him off. $35,000, he stated firmly. $40,000, Wells responded without hesitation. A shocked hush fell over the room. The previous record for the entire annual auction had been $32,000 combined across all items. The current bidding for a single dog with over 147,000 miles of police service and limited working years ahead had transcended all reasonable valuation. Through this escalation, Emma had continued methodically counting her savings, oblivious to the adult machinations around her. She had arranged $24.75 in coins and bills beside her on the seat. Finally looking up, she whispered something to Margaret, the first attempted communication she had initiated in a public setting for years. Margaret leaned down, straining to hear. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emma's lips moved, But no audible sound emerged. Frustrated, she pointed urgently to her money, then to Rex, her meaning clear even without words. She wanted to add her savings to their bid. The moment crystallized the emotional core of the event in a way no adult arguments about policy or liability could match. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded to Emma, then raised her paddle once more. "I have $40,000 from number 28, the auctioneer noted. Number 37, are you bidding again?" Margaret stood, her voice steady despite her emotion. "My daughter would like to add $24.75 to our previous bid. That's every penny she saved since she was 3 years old." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Richard stood beside his wife and stepdaughter, his earlier reservations visibly replaced by protective determination. The auctioneer, a veteran of 30 years' experience, found himself momentarily speechless. Recovering, he said, "I have a bid of $5,689.75 from the Brownlee Cooper family." The technical inadequacy of this figure against the current high bid of $40,000 was obvious to everyone. What happened next would be debated in Weld County for years to come. James Blackwell rose to his feet. $50,000, he stated, his voice carrying an edge of challenge directed not at Margaret but at Steve Wells. Before Wells could respond, a commotion from the stage drew all attention. Rex, breaking his perfect stay for the first time in the memory of any handler present, had stood alert, eyes fixed on Emma. When Officer Murphy attempted to reestablish control with a subtle correction to the leash, Rex resisted not aggressively, but with the calm, immovable determination that made German Shepherds legendary as working dogs. The sudden tension in Rex transmitted itself to Murphy, who recognized something significant was happening. Rather than force compliance, he allowed the dog a controlled movement forward to the edge of the stage, where Rex's focus on Emma intensified. In that charged moment, Emma slipped from her mother's grasp and stepped into the center aisle. Margaret reached for her, but Richard gently held her back, intuiting that something crucial was unfolding. Standing alone in the aisle, Emma reached for the badge around her neck, her father's badge, his shield number still visible despite years of being held in small fingers. She raised it toward Rex, a gesture reminiscent of how Samuel might have displayed his identification. The room fell silent as Officer Murphy, responding to a handler's instinct honed over years of K-9 work, made a split-second decision. He unclipped Rex's leash, giving the dog freedom while maintaining a hand signal that communicated controlled release rather than free movement. Rex stepped carefully from the stage and approached Emma with the measured pace of a working dog on assignment. He stopped precisely 3 feet from her, the exact distance K-9s were trained to maintain when guarding a protected individual. Emma's lips moved. Nothing audible reached the stunned audience, but Rex's ears twitched forward in response. She spoke again, and this time, though still barely above a whisper, her words carried in the absolute silence of the room. "Wait for command." It was one of her father's training phrases, words Samuel had used hundreds of times during Rex's development as a police K-9. The dog's response was immediate. He settled into a perfect guard position, attentive and prepared. Emma turned to face the audience, her small face showing determination that belied her years. When she spoke again, her voice gained strength with each word, rusty from disuse but increasingly clear. "My daddy said Rex is not just a dog. He's an officer." Her hand touched the badge at her neck. "Like this, it means he protects people who need him." She looked back at Rex, then directly at the auctioneer. "I need him." The simplicity and clarity of this statement, coming from a child who had not spoken publicly in 5 years, created an almost physical impact in the room. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming unchecked. Richard stood motionless, witnessing the breakthrough they had all but abandoned hope for. The auctioneer, a father himself, cleared his throat repeatedly before finding his voice. "Young lady, are you bidding on this K-9? Emma nodded solemnly. "Everything I have," she said, gesturing to her carefully counted savings. Before the auctioneer could respond to this unprecedented situation, Steve Wells stood. $60,000, he stated, his voice carrying clearly. As Blackwell turned toward him, Wells added with quiet finality, "And I believe that concludes the bidding." Blackwell studied Wells for a long moment, then gave a single nod of concession and sat down. Whether recognizing the futility of competing with Wells' resources or acknowledging the emotional current in the room, he had elected to withdraw. $60,000, the auctioneer confirmed, recovering his professional demeanor. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 28 for $60,000. A spontaneous applause broke out, quickly swelling to fill the room. Officer Murphy approached Emma, officially presenting Rex's leash to her with the formal handover used when canines transferred between handlers. Canine Rex, new handler, he stated, following protocol despite the unconventional circumstances. Emma accepted the leash with the same solemnity, then broke into the first smile anyone had seen from her in years as Rex pressed closer, maintaining his protective position beside her. The photographer from the Tribune captured the moment: a small girl, a retired police dog, and the palpable connection between them that had transcended departmental policy, adult agendas, and the barriers of trauma-induced silence. As the crowd surrounded them, Margaret and Richard found themselves face to face with Steve Wells, who had made his way forward. Margaret began to express her confusion and gratitude, but Wells shook his head. "The dog belongs with her," he said simply. He reached into his pocket and extracted an envelope, handing it to the auctioneer. The payment in full. Chief Dawson, who had watched the proceedings with increasing astonishment, approached their small group. "Mr. Wells, while we appreciate your generous bid, perhaps we should discuss the practical aspects of placing a trained police canine in a family home. There are liability considerations." Already addressed, Wells interrupted, producing another envelope from his jacket. "My attorneys have prepared comprehensive liability coverage and provisions for continued training support." He glanced at Emma, who remained focused entirely on Rex. "That dog knows exactly where he belongs, Chief. Sometimes it's best not to overcomplicate matters." As administrative details were handled by the adults, Emma knelt beside Rex, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder in a gesture uncannily similar to how her father had often stood with his canine partner. Officer Murphy observed with professional interest as she whispered something that caused the shepherd's ears to prick forward attentively. "What did she say to him?" Murphy asked Margaret quietly. Margaret watched her daughter, a bittersweet joy filling her chest. "The same thing Samuel always told him at the end of their shift: we're going home now." The initial elation that swept through the community center began to fracture as practical realities asserted themselves in the aftermath of the unprecedented auction. While Emma stood quietly beside Rex, her small hand clutching his leash with newfound confidence, the adults surrounding them dissolved into heated discussion. Chief Dawson, despite Wells' assurances about liability coverage, pulled Officer Murphy aside for an urgent consultation. Their conversation, though conducted in professional undertones, carried unmistakable tension that rippled through the room. "Department policy is explicit," Dawson insisted, gesturing toward the documentation folder he always carried. "Regardless of the bid amount or emotional circumstances, the transfer of a trained police K-9 requires formal decommissioning protocols and handler certification for the receiving party." His gaze shifted meaningfully toward Emma. "A child cannot be certified as a handler. Period." Margaret sensed the shift in atmosphere and moved protectively closer to Emma, who remained oblivious to the administrative storm brewing around her, focused entirely on Rex. For the first time in 5 years, her daughter's face showed something beyond the flat effect that had become her standard expression. A subtle softening around her eyes, was a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. The transformation, though understated, struck Margaret as nothing short of miraculous. "We have the winning bid," she reminded Dawson, keeping her voice level despite the anxiety building in her chest. "Mr. Wells has covered all financial aspects and liability concerns." Dawson's expression remained impassive. "Mrs. Cooper, this isn't about money. K9 Rex represents a significant investment of departmental resources in specialized training. His capabilities include suspect apprehension and tactical response. These aren't compatible with placement in a home with a minor, regardless of emotional considerations. He glanced at his watch. I'm convening an emergency meeting of the Department Oversight Committee to review this situation. In the meantime, Officer Murphy will retain custody of K9 Rex. The pronouncement fell like a physical blow. Emma, detecting the change in her mother's posture, looked up with dawning comprehension as Murphy approached with apologetic professionalism. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said gently, extending his hand for Rex's leash. "Just for a little while, until we sort everything out." Emma's fingers tightened around the leather strap, her recently recovered voice deserting her once more. She looked to her mother with panicked eyes, then to Richard, who stood helplessly nearby, clearly torn between supporting his stepdaughter and respecting departmental authority. Margaret's protest died on her lips as Wells stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of determination. "Chief Dawson, my bid was accepted in good faith. The auction was conducted according to your department's established procedures." His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of someone accustomed to having his directives followed. "I suggest you consider carefully before creating a situation that might require legal review." The implied threat hung in the air, creating a palpable tension that even casual observers could detect. Newspaper reporters, initially focused on the heartwarming reunion, shifted their attention to the confrontation developing between Wells and Dawson. James Blackwell, who had remained seated during the dramatic auction conclusion, now approached the group. His expression betrayed nothing of his thoughts as he addressed Dawson. "My company has extensive experience with K9 placements, Chief. If I might suggest a compromise, conditional placement with ongoing departmental oversight and professional handler assistance." He glanced toward Wells. "I could provide certified handlers to work with the family on proper management protocols at my company's expense." The unexpected offer from his recent bidding rival clearly caught Wells off guard. Margaret looked between the two wealthy men with growing confusion about their motives and alliances. Before anyone could respond to Blackwell's proposal, a sharp cry from behind them shattered the tense negotiation. Emma had sunk to her knees, arms wrapped tightly around Rex's neck, her small body shaking with silent sobs. The shepherd stood perfectly still, allowing her embrace while maintaining a protective stance, but his attention divided between the distressed child and the circle of adults whose voices had risen in conflict. The sight pierced through the administrative arguments with stark emotional clarity. But this was no longer about departmental policy or liability concerns. It was about a traumatized child facing another devastating loss. Rex, sensing Emma's distress, positioned himself more firmly against her, his posture communicating what everyone present recognized from K9 training: protective mode. Officer Murphy stepped back, professional assessment overtaking departmental loyalty. "Sir," he said quietly to Dawson, "in my professional opinion, separation at this point would create significant trauma risk." His hands, which had been extended for the leash, dropped to his sides. "I've never seen Rex bond with anyone like this since Deputy Brownlee." Dawson's expression hardened, the mention of Samuel Brownlee striking a complicated chord. Samuel had been more than a colleague. He had been Dawson's protégé, a promising officer whose death had left the chief with a lingering sense of responsibility toward his family. That same responsibility now demanded adherence to department protocols designed to protect both the public and the department from liability. "The emotional aspect is regrettable," Dawson stated firmly, "but policy exists for reasons beyond sentimentality. K9 Rex remains department property until formal transfer documentation is completed." He turned to Murphy with unmistakable authority. "Secure the K9 officer." "That's an order." Murphy hesitated, visibly conflicted, but ultimately moved toward Emma with practiced handler efficiency. As his hand closed around Rex's collar, Emma's silent tears transformed into something more primal, a keening wail that echoed through the community center with raw anguish. The sound, coming from a child who had been silent for years, carried such visceral pain that conversations throughout the room abruptly ceased. Margaret dropped to her knees beside her daughter, arms encircling both child and dog in desperate protection. "Please," she pleaded, looking up at Dawson. "She's just found her voice again. Don't take this from her." Richard, witnessing his wife and stepdaughter huddled on the floor, made a decision that surprised even himself. He stepped between Murphy and the trio on the floor, physically blocking the officer's access. "This isn't right," he said simply, his earlier ambivalence replaced by clear conviction. The standoff created an excruciating tableau: department authority versus family desperation, policy versus compassion, professional obligation versus human connection. Reporters captured images that would dominate the next day's coverage, framing a community conflict that transcended the simple question of a dog's placement. In the tense silence that followed, Rex made his own position clear. When Murphy attempted to move around Richard, the shepherd emitted a low warning rumble, not aggressive enough to qualify as threatening, but unmistakably protective. The sound carried familiar significance to everyone with K9 training present. Rex had identified Emma as his charge to protect. This canine declaration created an unprecedented dilemma for the department. A K9 trained to protect law enforcement personnel had apparently transferred that loyalty to a civilian child, creating a situation no policy manual had anticipated. As the impasse continued, Emma's sobs gradually subsided into hiccuping breaths. She whispered something to Rex that no one else could hear, then slowly rose to her feet, the shepherd moving in perfect synchronization with her. With dignity beyond her years, she approached Dawson directly, her face streaked with tears, but her posture resolute. "My daddy said an officer keeps his promises," she stated, her voice wobbling but audible. "Rex promised to take care of me. He can't break his promise." The simplicity of this appeal, delivered with a child's unassailable logic, created a visible impact on Dawson. For a brief moment, his professional mask slipped, revealing the conflict beneath. He had known Samuel Brownlee well, had attended his wedding, had held infant Emma at her christening. The personal connection he had carefully compartmentalized throughout the auction proceedings suddenly refused to remain contained. Before he could respond, his phone rang with strident urgency. Checking the display, Dawson's expression shifted to resignation. "The county commissioner," he explained tersely before stepping away to take the call. The interruption left the group in uneasy limbo. Emma returned to Rex's side, her hand instinctively finding its place on his shoulder, the exact position her father had used when issuing commands. The shepherd responded with perfect stillness, his training evident in every line of his body. When Dawson returned minutes later, his face had settled into official neutrality. "The commissioner has received numerous calls from concerned citizens. The situation has been escalated beyond departmental jurisdiction." He squared his shoulders, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say next. "A temporary custody arrangement has been ordered pending formal review. K9 Rex will remain with the Cooper family under the supervision of certified handlers until the committee reaches a final determination." The partial victory felt hollow against the emotional devastation of the preceding confrontation. Though Rex would come home with them tonight, the reprieve carried no guarantees. Tomorrow could bring another separation, another trauma, another battle. The uncertainty hung over what should have been a moment of triumph, casting a shadow that dimmed Emma's fragile reemergence from years of silence. As they prepared to leave, Wells approached Margaret one final time. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his tone carrying both reassurance and determination. "But tonight she takes her dog home." He glanced toward Blackwell, who stood conversing with Dawson across the room. "Watch that one carefully. Men like him always have secondary motives." With these cryptic words, Wells departed, leaving Margaret to wonder about the enigmatic farmer's interest in their situation and what the coming days would bring. For tonight, at least, Emma would sleep with Rex beside her bed, a temporary victory that felt precarious against the institutional forces assembled against them. The morning after the auction, Emma sat at the kitchen table watching Rex adjust to his new surroundings. The German Shepherd moved with methodical precision through each room, his training evident in the systematic way he investigated every corner, door, and window, a security sweep ingrained by years of police service. Margaret prepared breakfast, stealing glances at her daughter, who had spoken more in the previous day than in the past 5 years combined. Though Emma had retreated somewhat into her silence since returning home, the occasional whispered commands to Rex confirmed that her voice had not disappeared entirely. Richard entered carrying the morning newspaper, his expression troubled as he set it on the table away from Emma's view. The headline read, "Controversy erupts over K-9 placement, department policy versus child's needs." Accompanying photos showed Emma clinging to Rex, while officers stood by, capturing both the emotional power and administrative complexity of the situation. "The committee meets at 3 o'clock, Richard informed Margaret quietly. "Wells' attorney called this morning. He'll be representing our interests." Margaret nodded, grateful for the unexpected alliance, yet still puzzled by the wealthy farmer's involvement. Before she could reply, a knock at the front door startled them all. Rex immediately positioned himself between Emma and the potential threat, his posture alert but controlled. Officer Murphy stood on their porch, accompanied by a woman in professional attire carrying a briefcase. "Mrs. Cooper," Murphy said, his tone apologetic, "this is Sandra Hayes from County Family Services. She's here to conduct a home assessment as part of the committee's evaluation process." The implications were immediately clear. This had escalated beyond a question of K-9 department policy. Now county authorities were evaluating their home environment, adding another layer of scrutiny to their precarious situation. As Hayes conducted her inspection, making notes about the physical environment and Rex's behavior, Emma remained glued to the shepherd's side. When asked direct questions about her care of Rex, she responded with whispers that grew slightly louder with each exchange, her confidence visibly building through Rex's steady presence. "He sleeps by my bed," she explained when Hayes inquired about nighttime arrangements. "He keeps the bad dreams away." "And how do you know what he needs?" Hayes asked, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Emma touched the badge at her neck. "Daddy taught me. Before. I remember everything." This simple declaration, the first acknowledgement that Emma retained clear memories from before her trauma, caused Margaret to press her hand against her mouth, suppressing an emotional reaction that might disrupt the fragile assessment process. As Hayes prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway. "The committee will consider multiple factors, Mrs. Cooper. I should inform you that Mr. Blackwell has submitted a formal alternative placement proposal offering professional handler supervision and visitation rights for Emma." Her expression revealed nothing of her personal opinion as she added, "His resources for specialized care are substantial." After Hayes and Murphy departed, the family sat in stunned silence, the temporary victory of bringing Rex home now clearly threatened by Blackwell's continued interest. Richard paced the living room, frustration evident in every movement. Why is he pursuing this? Margaret wondered aloud. There must be dozens of retired K-9s available across the country. Why fixate on Rex specifically? It doesn't make sense, Richard agreed. The breeding value alone can't justify this level of persistence. The mystery deepened when Wells arrived unannounced an hour later. The farmer declined refreshments, his weathered face grave as he placed a folder on their coffee table. "You need to see this before the committee meeting," he stated without preamble. "My investigator compiled it over the past week." Inside were documents revealing a connection they had never suspected. Blackwell's security company had recently secured a major contract with a pharmaceutical corporation that had been the target of one of Deputy Samuel Brownlee's last investigations before his death. Rex had been instrumental in that case, trained in detecting specific chemical compounds used in illegal manufacturing. Samuel and Rex uncovered evidence of prohibited research, Wells explained, his gravelly voice carrying barely contained anger. The case was still building when Samuel died. Without its primary investigator, the prosecution stalled and ultimately collapsed on technicalities. Margaret stared at the documents, memories surfacing of Samuel's preoccupation in the weeks before his death. He was working long hours, she recalled. Said it was potentially his biggest case, but couldn't discuss details. Blackwell wants Rex because of what he knows. Wells continued, or more precisely what Rex might help someone else discover if the investigation were ever reopened. A dog trained to alert on those specific compounds represents a liability to his new client. The revelation cast Blackwell's persistence in an entirely new light, not as interest in a valuable canine, but as an attempt to neutralize a potential threat to his business interests. The ethical implications were staggering. Richard studied Wells with newfound suspicion. "How do you know all this? And why are you involved at all?" Wells' expression shifted, professional detachment giving way to something raw and personal. He withdrew a photograph from his wallet, a young woman in her 20s with his same determined jawline, standing beside a German Shepherd puppy. "My daughter, Sarah," he said quietly. "She died 5 years ago, the same month as Deputy Brownlee." He paused, composing himself. Sarah was a chemical engineer at that pharmaceutical company. She discovered irregularities in their research protocols and reported them internally. 2 weeks later, she died in what was ruled an accident. The pieces suddenly aligned with devastating clarity. Samuel was investigating her death? Margaret asked. Among others, Wells confirmed. 3 whistleblowers, 3 accidents within 18 months. Sarah was the last. His weathered hands carefully returned the photograph to his wallet. "I've spent 5 years and millions of dollars seeking what Samuel and Rex began to uncover. When I learned Rex was being auctioned, I recognized both the threat and the opportunity. The full weight of this truth settled over them just as the time approached for the committee meeting. As they prepared to leave, Emma emerged from her room wearing her best dress, the badge prominently displayed around her neck. "Rex comes too," she stated with unexpected firmness. The committee hearing took place in a small conference room at the county administration building. Dawson and 3 other department officials sat on one side of a long table, with the county commissioner presiding at the head. Blackwell was already seated when the Coopers arrived with Wells and his attorney. Rex, wearing his official K9 vest at Emma's insistence, drew immediate objections from Dawson. "This proceeding will determine the K9's placement," he protested. "Having him present creates an emotional spectacle that undermines objective assessment." Before the commissioner could rule on this objection, Emma stepped forward, her voice small but clear in the formal setting. "Rex is a police officer," she stated with the absolute conviction of a child's logic. "He should hear what people say about him." This simple declaration, coming from a child who had been silent for years, created a moment of uncomfortable silence among the officials. The commissioner, a grandmother herself, nodded slowly. "The K9 may remain, provided he causes no disruption." What followed was unlike any placement hearing in county history. Department officials presented technical arguments about training protocols and liability concerns. Hayes delivered her home assessment report, which proved surprisingly favorable regarding Emma's understanding of Rex's needs and the dog's protective but controlled behavior toward the child. When Blackwell presented his alternative placement proposal, emphasizing the superior resources and professional handling his facility could provide, Blackwell's attorney requested permission to introduce new evidence regarding conflicts of interest. Blackwell's objection was immediate and vehement, but the commissioner's curiosity was piqued. "The committee should be aware," Wells' attorney stated, "that Mr. Blackwell's company recently secured a 7-figure contract with Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the same corporation that was under investigation by Deputy Brownlee prior to his death. K9 Rex was specifically trained to detect compounds central to that investigation." The room erupted in murmurs as Blackwell rose to his feet, face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous speculation intended to prejudice the committee against a legitimate placement offer. Is there documentation supporting this claim?" the commissioner asked, maintaining her composure amid the sudden tension. Wells' attorney provided copies of both the security contract and the original investigation files, which had never been officially closed despite the suspended prosecution. As officials reviewed these materials, Blackwell's controlled demeanor crumbled. "This is about placement of a retired K9, nothing more," he insisted, but his confident presentation had given way to defensive agitation. When the commissioner inquired specifically about his client's interest in Rex rather than other available K9s, his explanation became increasingly convoluted. During this exchange, Richard, who had remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly stood. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice steadier than he felt. All eyes turned to him, including Margaret's, filled with apprehension about what her husband might add to this already complex situation. "When this began, I opposed bringing Rex into our home," Richard admitted, avoiding Margaret's gaze. "I was resentful of the past hold on my wife and stepdaughter. I even spoke with Mr. Blackwell about ensuring the dog would go elsewhere." He paused, gathering courage for his confession. "I was wrong. Profoundly wrong." Richard turned toward Emma, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "I wanted to erase the pain by erasing the reminders, but that's not how healing works. I understand that now." He looked up at the committee. "This isn't just about a child loving a dog. This is about Emma having the support she needs to find her voice again, to process her loss, to move forward without forgetting. Rex isn't keeping her trapped in the past, he's helping her bridge it to the future." The simplicity and sincerity of this statement, coming from the person who had most opposed Rex's placement, carried an impact no legal argument could match. As Richard returned to his seat, Margaret reached for his hand, a silent acknowledgement of both his confession and his transformation. The commissioner, after conferring briefly with committee members, addressed the room with newfound resolve. "In light of both the emotional considerations and the troubling questions raised about motivations in this case, this committee will adjourn for deliberation. We will reconvene with our decision in 1 hour." The hour of deliberation stretched interminably for the family waiting in the corridor outside the committee room. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, Rex positioned protectively beside her, his alert posture softening only when she whispered to him. Margaret and Richard stood nearby, their hands clasped in a unity that would have seemed impossible days earlier. Steve Wells paced the hallway with measured steps, occasionally checking his phone as his attorney made calls regarding the evidence they had presented. When the committee doors finally opened, Commissioner Eleanor Grant's expression revealed nothing as she invited them to return. Blackwell entered from a side door, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished, flanked by corporate attorneys who had arrived during the recess. "This committee has reached a unanimous decision," Commissioner Grant announced once everyone was seated. "In the matter of K9 Rex's placement, we find that the exceptional circumstances of this case warrant an equally exceptional resolution." She adjusted her reading glasses, consulting her notes with deliberate precision. "The Weld County Sheriff's Department's policy regarding K9 retirement was established to ensure proper care and management of trained service animals while protecting the department from liability concerns. However, policies must serve the public good, not become obstacles to it." Chief Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the commissioner continued. "It is the finding of this committee that K9 Rex's specialized training and the Brownlee Cooper family's unique circumstances create a compelling case for exception to standard protocol. Therefore, we approve the permanent placement of K9 Rex with Emma Brownlee Cooper, subject to the following conditions." Emma's small intake of breath was the only sound in the room as Commissioner Grant enumerated the terms: quarterly evaluations by Department K9 specialists, completion of a modified handler training program adapted for Emma's age, and continuation of her therapy with Dr. Winters. Minimum. The final condition surprised everyone. Rex would retain a modified service status with specialized training to function as a therapy animal for other children experiencing trauma. Furthermore, the commissioner added, fixing Blackwell with a pointed stare, "This committee is referring all evidence regarding potential conflicts of interest in the suspended investigation to the State Attorney General's office for review." Blackwell's attorneys immediately launched into procedural objections, but their protests faded to background noise as Emma processed the reality that Rex was truly finally hers. She buried her face in the shepherd's fur, her shoulders shaking with silent tears of relief. As the formal proceedings concluded, Wells approached the family, his weathered face showing the first genuine smile they had seen. Sarah would have approved, he said simply, extending his hand to Richard, who accepted it with newfound respect. "We can never repay you," Margaret began, but Wells shook his head. "This was never about debt or gratitude," he replied. "Some things are simply right." He glanced toward Emma, who was showing Rex her badge, explaining something in her still soft voice. "That dog found his true handler. Anyone with eyes can see it." Outside the county building, a small crowd of supporters had gathered, officers who had served with Samuel, neighbors who had contributed to the GoFundMe, even Emma's classmates holding hand-drawn signs celebrating Rex's homecoming. The spontaneous reception created a moment of public affirmation that transformed the administrative victory into a community celebration. Officer Murphy approached with formal transfer papers and Rex's service record. "You'll want these for your scrapbook," he told Emma with a wink. "Rex has quite the distinguished career. 16 successful tracks, 43 narcotic alerts, 3 apprehensions." He knelt to the dog's level, given a final handler's assessment. "And now he has the most important assignment of all." In the days that followed, the family established new routines centered around Rex's integration into their home. Emma's voice grew incrementally stronger as she worked with Rex on basic commands, her confidence building with each successful interaction. Dr. Winters observed these sessions with professional satisfaction, documenting Emma's progress while providing guidance on translating the bond with Rex into broader social engagement. Richard, true to his committee testimony, embraced his role in supporting Emma's connection with Rex rather than resenting it. He built a custom dog bed that fit perfectly in the corner of Emma's room and researched canine nutrition with scientific thoroughness. His efforts to connect with his stepdaughter through their shared care for Rex created bridges where walls had previously stood. The case that Wells had illuminated gained traction with state investigators, who reopened the pharmaceutical investigation with the assistance of specialized forensic chemists. While the adult complexities of this process remained largely beyond Emma's awareness, she understood that her father and Rex had been working on something important together, a mission that remained unfinished. 6 months after the auction, the family attended the annual Fallen Officers Memorial Ceremony. Emma had been invited to participate, a significant step in her ongoing recovery. Standing before the gathered department personnel and families, with Rex at perfect attention beside her, she faced her greatest challenge yet, speaking publicly about her father. "My daddy was a hero," she began, her voice small but clear in the microphone. "But heroes don't always win every battle. Sometimes other heroes have to finish what they started." She glanced down at Rex, who maintained his ceremonial stillness despite clearly monitoring her emotional state. "Rex was my daddy's partner. Now he's mine. Together we remember." The simplicity and authenticity of her statement moved even the most stoic officers present. Chief Dawson, who had so strenuously opposed Rex's placement, approached afterward with uncharacteristic humility. "Your father would be proud," he told Emma, then added more formally, "The department recognizes K9 Rex's continued service in his new capacity. You're doing an excellent job as his handler, Officer Brownlee." The honorary title brought the first full smile anyone had seen from Emma. A transformation that illuminated her face and revealed the healing taking place beneath the surface of her ongoing recovery. 1 year after the auction that had changed everything, the Cooper home hosted a special celebration, a combination of Rex's service anniversary and Emma's 8th birthday. The gathering included both family friends and new connections formed through Emma and Rex's work with other children experiencing trauma. Through a program developed in collaboration with Dr. Winters, they now visited the Children's Hospital monthly, where Rex's gentle presence helped young patients find comfort and sometimes their own voices. Margaret watched her daughter moving confidently among the guests, Rex always nearby, but no longer required to be touching distance at all times, progress that had seemed impossible a year earlier. Richard approached, handing her a small wrapped package. From Wells, he explained, delivered this morning. Inside was an antique compass with a note in Wells' precise handwriting. For Emma, sometimes we need help finding our true north. Sarah's case closed today. Justice served. Thank you. The cryptic message required no elaboration. News reports had documented the indictments of pharmaceutical executives following the reopened investigation, though Wells' personal connection remained private knowledge. The compass represented not just closure for Wells, but acknowledgement of how Emma and Rex had helped him navigate his own grief journey. As evening approached and guests departed, Emma sat on the porch swing that had once been her silent refuge, Rex resting at her feet. Margaret and Richard joined them, the family unit now comfortable in its reconfigured bonds. I was thinking, Emma said, her voice carrying the confidence that grew stronger each day, Rex needs a job besides just taking care of me. He seems pretty content with that assignment, Richard observed, reaching down to scratch the shepherd's ears. But Daddy always said Rex was happiest when he was working, Emma persisted. Dr. Winter says I'm getting better at talking to people now. Maybe Rex and I could help other kids who don't have their voices yet. The mature compassion behind this suggestion brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Here was the true healing they had hoped for, not just recovery from trauma, but growth beyond it, finding purpose in helping others navigate similar darkness. I think that's a wonderful idea, she replied. We can talk to Dr. Winters about expanding your hospital visits. As twilight settled over their home, Emma leaned against her mother, watching the first stars appear. Rex remained alert at their feet, his attention divided between his family and the surrounding environment, always on duty, always protective, yet fully at home. You know what Daddy used to say about Rex? Emma asked, her voice soft with memory rather than fragility. Margaret shook her head, treasuring these rare glimpses into Emma's recollections of Samuel. He said Rex could find lost things. Emma's fingers absently touched the badge at her neck. I think Daddy was right. Rex found my voice when it was lost. In the gathering darkness, the family remained on the porch, bound together by love that had weathered grief, conflict, and institutional barriers strengthened rather than diminished by their journey. Rex's steady presence anchored them all, a living bridge between past and future, loss and recovery, silence and voice. Commissioner Grant's words from the placement hearing had proven prophetic. Policies must serve the public good, not become obstacles to it. In granting exception for one child and one dog, the committee had affirmed something essential about community, compassion, and healing, a lesson that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of their case. For Emma, the simple truth remained the most profound. Rex had found what was lost, and in doing so had found his own true home. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.